Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. So we're going to take one out of the independent media playbook today, and we're going to critically analyze a news story which is circulating some of the mainstream news networks and publications on the internet. And this story that we're going to talk about, it's something that we as preppers are quite familiar with, and it's the concept of electromagnetic pulse and the potential for it to cause basically widespread suffering across very large regions. So generally speaking, how an EMP works: when you detonate a nuclear weapon in space, there's also this electromagnetic pulse which is given off from the splitting of those atoms, and this causes voltage surges throughout the grid which can blow transformers and basically destroy electronics that have complex circuitry. So the idea is then that because the United States is heavily technologically dependent, that of course the grid would be down for a significant length of time, because the argument is that these transformers require a lot of time to produce, and a lot of the parts come from different countries, and as far as I know, a lot of them aren't even manufactured in the United States anymore. So the United States is not hardened for an electromagnetic pulse attack. Now that that's out of the way, why is the mainstream media all of a sudden reporting on this? That really is the question. Because as preppers, we've been familiar with this concept for a long time. If anybody's ever read the book 1 Second After, I will post a link to the audiobook in the description. It's an excellent book for you to just listen to while you're driving, if you really want to get a sense of what an EMP post-apocalyptic scenario might look like. But what intrigues me is that how suddenly, at the drop of a hat, and I know a lot of these news stories trickle down from the Associated Press, and they go through the various media filters, and they basically extend out from there to all these little independent media agencies. And they're not really independent media agencies, because you got Forbes talking about this, you got Yahoo News, which is big time, you have The Sun, you have Daily Mail, which is questionable at best, you have the Telegraph, Washington Examiner. So you have a lot of these various media sources all of a sudden parlaying this news story about killing 90% of Americans. We have to ask ourselves, what is the real agenda behind publishing a story like this? Because on the one hand, while this idea has a lot of merit and while it's worth preparing for, if anything, that or a pandemic or World War III are basically the three big time apocalyptic scenarios that are probably worth preparing for, because not being prepared for them would probably result in a much more long-winded, extended form of suffering than just going in the initial blast, as a lot of people might appreciate. So let's just talk a bit about this article. Now, like I said, on the one hand, it's great that they're talking about this because it gets the average person interested, and probably more interested in preparedness, which is great, because not only is it going to broaden our audience as YouTube preppers, but it's also hopefully going to get people thinking about how dependent we are on technology. And a lot of news stories which are spun off this congressional report which was put out really do get into the gritty details. But at the same time, we must be critical of the fact that while there may be some truth to this 90% claim, that this can also be used as propaganda to instigate a war with North Korea in the first place, because then the idea would be that, well, we need to, attack them before they are able to pull something like this off. And that very well could be part of the agenda here. You just never know what the actual motivation with these mainstream media stories are. So let's dive into this right away. So a new congressional report contends that a North Korean electromagnetic pulse attack on the US would ultimately wipe out 90% of the population. To date, most discussion concerning the North Korean threat has revolved around, and I'm paraphrasing here, ICBMs, yada yada yada. But in an electromagnetic pulse attack, such accuracy is not necessary because the pulse radius would be so large, says Peter Vincent Pry, who recently testified about the EMP threat before a Congressional Homeland Security Committee. His conclusions are that such an EMP attack would wreak havoc across the whole of the continental US. And it should be noted that there's videos on YouTube of lots of high-ranking senior officials within, the CIA, government, military, wargaming and strategizing about electromagnetic pulse and how it is a very real threat. So it is a legitimate, credible threat. Unlike a conventional ICBM, which launches and then goes into suborbital flight before entering Earth's atmosphere, an EMP warhead need not re-enter Earth's atmosphere before exploding hundreds of kilometers above its target. Super electromagnetic pulse weapons are designed to produce high level of gamma radiation. That's the radiation that you basically can't see, which generate the sort of high frequency electromagnetic pulse that is most damaging to the broadest range of electronics. And if the EMP device just happens to be part of an onboard orbiting satellite, North Korea need only detonate the device remotely via encoded signal. So Pry was chief of staff of the now defunded, so for whatever reason it's not being funded anymore, Congressional EMP Commission, told me that at an altitude of 300 kilometers, the resulting electromagnetic pulse would affect all 45 contiguous states. Let's get down to the nitty-gritty here. So the US can sustain a population of 320 million people only because of modern technology. We all know this. Go back, watch my After the Collapse videos. I talk about this in great depth. An EMP that blocks out the electrical grid for a year would decimate, and you should understand that the word decimate means to reduce by a factor of 10. So really, I think they're talking about a lot more than decimation here if they're talking about 90%. The critical infrastructure necessary to support such a large population. In 3 days, the food supply in local grocery stores would be consumed, and the 30-day national food supply in regional warehouses would begin to spoil. In 1 year, 90% of the population could perish from starvation, disease, and societal collapse. After generating gamma rays that interact with air molecules in the Earth's stratosphere, the so-called fast pulse EMP field of tens of kilovolts would only last a few hundred nanoseconds. So this would be an instantaneous thing. But in the event of such attack, Air Force electronics would be fried, as well as electronics in air traffic control towers and navigation systems. Airliners would crash, killing many of the 500,000 people flying over North America at any given moment. There would be no water, no communications, and mass transportation would be paralyzed, says Pry. In 7 days, he contends that reactors in U.S. nuclear power plants would essentially melt down, spreading radioactivity across most of the nation. That's pretty serious stuff, folks. What could be done to ensure a quick restoration of the grid? Some 2,000 extra high voltage transformers make up the foundation of the U.S. power grid, but as he notes, since they each weigh hundreds of tons, they are extraordinarily hard to transport. Thus, if most are destroyed, there's no quick fix. So how do we best protect against electromagnetic pulse? The U.S. should be prepared to also include limited surgical strikes to destroy North Korea's ICBMs, but he says the best, safest, and least provocative solution is to EMP harden the electrical grid and other critical infrastructures. Now, here's where it gets interesting to me, is that you're looking at a military-industrial complex which spends $1 trillion a year, essentially, on military hardware. Why wouldn't some company like Lockheed Martin get into the game of transformer hardening to bring it up to a military protective standard and make a market out of that? What is preventing that from happening? Because clearly, I think a lot of people, Americans in particular, would be okay with systematically and incrementally hardening the grid against such a thing. Why wouldn't you if you knew that this was a credible threat, especially when you have countries like Russia who could easily detonate several nuclear weapons over the United States, or any enemy of the United States who happens to have nuclear weapons. Fortunately, there's not a whole lot. But in any case, if this was as credible a threat as they say it is, why wouldn't they be investing that? Why wouldn't Lockheed Martin and all their lobbyists, why wouldn't they be banging on the door of, and I just use Lockheed Martin as an example, I'm not really too familiar with a lot of the different companies, but why wouldn't these companies be pushing for hardening of the electromagnetic pulse grid? It makes me ask some questions about that. All right, so let's take the devil's advocate approach, and now let's go check out the Popular Mechanics website. I can't remember who they're owned by, but they're owned by one of the mainstream media networks anyways, much like a lot of the agencies which are reporting that it is a threat, or at least parlaying this information they heard from this one guy by the name of Pry. This article starts off with, no, North Korea can't get rid of 90% of Americans. Earlier this week, the former director of the CIA penned an apocalyptic article in The Hill describing the end of American civilization. I'm just going to give you a synopsis of the article. Basically, what they're saying is that this guy who was in the CIA actually was referencing the book 1 second after when he threw out the 90% figure. So there's kind of a circular reasoning loop here, in that they're saying that the whole idea of 90% of the American population was a purely theoretical number thrown out by this book. Now, I'm not sure how valid that claim is, but they cite a lot of different research here which shows that the effects of EMP would be much less than what is typically predicted by a lot of the doomsday theorists. So that's good news, but it's also questionable as to what the agenda is with this and why they would be trying to discourage any sort of attention towards this. To me, if there's something even happens to be a threat, even if only 20 million people perish, they say that, well, you know, the idea that 90% of the population would perish from such things is a pipe dream. But even if 20 million people were killed in the instance of something like this, then it seems justifiable that you would take action and spend some of the billions upon billions of dollars simply prepping the Transformers, hardening them against such an attack. Now, they end this article by saying that trying to link the threat of electromagnetic pulse, which can also occur as a result of a coronal mass ejection, which is a natural event caused by the sun and solar flares, they argue that it can do more damage to the idea by trying to link North Korea with it if it's not a credible threat. So there very well could be something that happens with the sun, and it sends a burst of radiation our way, which basically knocks out our power grid. And they're saying that while that is a possibility, putting out these exaggerated claims of what North Korea is capable of may just force the whole idea to be forgotten about. Thereby, we never protect the grid against those actual real threats. So it's hard to say what's really going on here. What do you guys think in the comments section? Let me know what your perspectives are of this story. I'll post links in the description. I think it's interesting to always keep a critical mind when you're hearing about these things. Just because MSNBC, which is not one of the agencies, but let's just say CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, started talking about electromagnetic pulse and 90% of people in the Western Hemisphere would perish as a result of it, doesn't mean that it's all of a sudden a fact. In fact, a lot of people still take the mainstream media as the final official word, even though they criticize it for other things. So let's say, for instance, mainstream media finally did validate a conspiracy theory. Well, a lot of conspiracy theorists just would say, yeah, we were right, but all of a sudden they're no longer then critical of the mainstream media narrative. You have to ask yourself, what is the agenda behind pushing something like this, a news story like this? Well, it has the benefit of hopefully making more people realize how technologically dependent we are on the power grid. Is there an ulterior motive here of perhaps using it as a propaganda piece to push the United States into conflict with North Korea, to try to scare the population into thinking that North Korea could actually pull this off? So that's something to keep in mind, and that's very important. Anytime you read a story like this, it's important not to just to say, oh, we told you so. We as preppers have been talking about this for a long time. It's important to also consider the broader picture. So let me know what you think in the comments. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share the video. Your support is very much appreciated. Thanks for watching. Canadian Prepper out.